Latin America was well into a process of regional integration that lasted until approximately 2008-9, when the capitalists decided to destroy the economy as they do regularly every 10 years. And as a consequence of that, we suffered the consequence, couldn't sustain the social programs, and the United States took advantage of that weakness because we are raw material exporting countries and hit us very hard and tried to roll it back. So that first period indicated in 10 years what you can do is extraordinary. If the United States let us do it, which they won't, but we'll fight against that, we will certainly blossom.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. My name is Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US escalating war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. As usual, we're going to be posting the first 30 minutes of this on YouTube, and the full episode is going to be available for people who are members of our Patreon, which you can either sign up to for free or give a regular donation to. So yeah, please do consider becoming a member of Patreon today, because that will help us sustain what we're doing. And of course, as a podcast, you can also find us on audio platforms like Spotify and Amazon Music.
Hi, we are so excited today that our guest on Global Majority for Peace is Dr. Francisco Dominguez. Dr. Francisco Dominguez is a former head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University. He is National Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in the UK and also a member of the executive committees of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign AG and the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in the UK. Dominguez came to Britain in 1979 as a political refugee from Chile's Pinochet. Ever since, he has been active on Latin American issues, about which he has written and published extensively, including on the opposition to neoliberalism and on the relations between China and Latin America. He is co-author of Right-Wing Politics in the New Latin America. Welcome, Francisco.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's brilliant to have you on. And just to start, really, I think Ileana's given a bit of a hint to this actually in the introduction just there, but we like to always begin our interviews on a personal note. So Francisco, could you start with telling us about the origin of your politicization? Was there a particular instant that led you to your current worldview?
I was in the 1960s as a secondary school kid in Chile, and we were hit by a wave of radicalization that engulfed the whole Latin America because of the Cuban Revolution. The revolution took place in 1959 in Cuba, and we're all very much inspired by all of that. And I remember the level of political activity among kids of 13, 14, 15, 16, and so on was extraordinary. And in Chile itself, we had the influence of political thinkers on the left, such as Violeta Parra in the 50s, which influenced a whole generation. Then we have the politics and poetry of Pablo Neruda, one of the greatest poets in Latin America, certainly in the world. And then we have, the various musical groups, which were extremely radical, such as Quilapayún, Inti Illimani, and then, of course, Victor Jara, who is famous internationally, and so on. So it was so enriching and so fantastic, I remember. But what really determined my view was when I joined the strike of the National Health Service, where I was an employee. And it was that strike that lasted for about 1 month or longer, where, demonstrations every day going to central town, clashes with the police and so on. And throughout the events, throughout the strike, I remember talking to so many people about politics. I learned so much, and that changed completely my view. And ever since, already I was on the left, but from that moment on, I decided I wanted not only to be left-wing, I wanted to change the world. And I've been trying ever since, not with much success, I'm afraid.
Oh, no. I think we all share that frustration. So, talking about Latin America, as you've sort of alluded to, Latin America has a rich and powerful history of struggling for independence, sovereignty, and social progress against the imperialist aggression and colonial mindset of the United States. Where is that struggle of the peoples of Latin America at today, and how do you perceive Trump's foreign policy impacting the region?
I think Trump's represents a continuation without the mask of the previous US administration's government of interfering very dramatically and sometimes quite brutally in the internal affairs of Latin America. I've read pamphlets about this where they indicate that the number of interventions by the United States in something like 200 years in Latin America is in the region of 180. I think it's worse than that. Nevertheless, in interventions, that it is military interventions, political interventions, engineering coup d'etat, assassination of people, and so forth. So therefore, we, on the one hand, are very unlucky because we have to cohabit the same continent with one of the worst imperialisms in the history of humanity. And, being very close, obviously, overdetermine what we do. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is that the United States has always tried to prevent our development, whether that is political development or whether that is economic development. The United States has been determined, and this is the institution, the state itself, the oligarchy that runs that place, is determined to prevent any country from becoming too strong, which will make them too autonomous. So therefore, the United States does everything to ensure that nobody gets too strong, nobody has development, and nobody actually becomes politically astute enough in order to establish international links with somebody else. And this is known as the Monroe Doctrine. The United States run the place, and you have to do what they tell you or else. So that has been the situation. Now, the United States, because it implemented neoliberal policies from 1973 onwards. In fact, the first country that suffered the imposition of neoliberalism was Chile in 1973. We became a laboratory guinea pig. They really implemented it massively, brutally, and so on. Just to give you a sense of what they did, between 1973 and 1990, when 1998, 1999, when countries began trying to be more independent, the level of poverty reached 48% of the whole continent, which is, extraordinarily high, really, really high. And this was regionally very unevenly distributed. So you have places which were more developed, such as Argentina, where during the neoliberal period, poverty will reach levels such as 35, 40%. But you have countries such as Honduras, or Central America, where the level of poverty reached 77, 82%, 83%. So that was, this was reality. But worse than that, in that what we call the neoliberal night, which lasted 30 years, the United States not only applied this brutal method of economics, which is neoliberalism, but it sustained it and upheld it with brutal violence. In Chile, they assassinated 5,000 people, under the Pinochet dictatorship during 17 years. In Argentina, next door, in 6 years, they assassinated 32,000. In Nicaragua, having the audacity to carry out a revolution against one of their cronies, US cronies, Somoza, 50,000 people were assassinated in the proxy war the United States unleashed against them. In Peru, for the same reason, 60,000 people were assassinated. In El Salvador, 80,000. In Guatemala, 120,000. Just to give you an idea of what we were actually contending with. So inevitably, given that people continue to struggle anyway, regardless of the extremely difficult circumstances and extremely dangerous ones as well, we inevitably develop a social vanguard which is quite extensive. And politics becomes quite radicalized and radical, inevitably, because of that. If you want to defend yourself, you want to defend to be able to live, then there is nothing else you can do but fight back. And that's why Latin America is so developed. And From 1998, when Chavez was elected in 1998, it created, well, conditions already existed for a wave of left-wing governments. I won't go into every single one of them because of time, but the whole continent was really extraordinarily developed in terms of left-wing governments that actually nationalized things, that, asserted their national sovereignty, told the United States no, stood up to them, improved the quality of life for people and so on. Just to give you one index of how this manifests itself, this positive thing. In something like a decade, we're talking about 2002, 2003, all the way to something like 2013, 2014, the rate of poverty fell from 44% to 26%. That is to say, something like 100 million people were taken out of poverty. Places where indigenous populations had been completely excluded were recognized, were given, restored their dignity, such as in Bolivia. I remember being in Bolivia, watching television, under the Evo Morales government, and then something was wrong in what I wasn't watching, I was sort of on the side of me, by the corner of the eye. I was aware of this television set. And what I noticed was that actually it was not in Spanish. It was in indigenous language. And when I asked why, they told me the reason is we have 37 languages which are official. One of them is Spanish. And when you look at the television set, it had Spanish subtitles. So that gives you an idea. Women were brought into politics. The excluded were brought in. Racism was fought against. Policies were implemented. And Latin America was well into a process of regional integration that lasted until approximately 2008-9, when the capitalists decided to destroy the economy as they do regularly every 10 years. And as a consequence of that, we suffered the consequence, couldn't sustain the social programs, and the United States took advantage of that weakness because we are raw material exporting countries and hit us very hard and tried to roll it back. So that first period indicated in 10 years what you can do is extraordinary. If the United States let us do it, which they won't, but we'll fight against that, we will certainly blossom. And that is the experience. At the moment, that we are trying to repeat the experience of that 10 years. And we're fighting back. We got Brazil back. We got Mexico, which is a novelty. There are several left wing governments, but it's not sufficient. And we need to intensify that spread of good politics and good government in order to ensure that we go back to where we wanted to be. And the United States, because it's weakening so massively, has become extremely nasty and extremely aggressive. Trump is a manifestation of that malaise in the United States. Sorry, I went on too long, but I think I wanted to give you a full picture if I could.
No, brilliant as ever, historical context really for this discussion, which I think is really important because we're going to get into a bit of a deep dive into quite specific things. So it's good for people to have that overview so they can work out what's going on. So just on what you just said at the end around, Trump's return to the White House, many people do view this as a sign of the accelerating decline of the US empire. And a really key feature of Trump's international policy has been the US administration's erratic use of tariffs. So what we wanted to discuss with you is how are these tariffs impacting Latin America and also the region's orientation moving forward? Obviously, you've mentioned how, the United States has really sought to dominate the region, but in the last couple of decades, we've seen a real blossoming of economic ties between Latin America and the Asian superpower China. So how did this sort of policy of the United States impact those dynamics?
Yeah, I will leave the relationship between Latin America and China to the last part of the conversation, if that's okay, because it especially requires some specific discussion. But Trump and the United States uses sanctions or unilateral coercive measures. This is their favorite tool. The problem has been this: the United States has been declining so badly in the last period. When you look at the figures, possibly it's been declining for 50 years. But now in the last period, become very intense, very deep. Just to give you a few figures, not too many. The United States GDP is $30 trillion, which is one of the biggest, in nominal terms, economies in the world. Its debt, its public debt, is 37 trillion. And that is to say, where the United States use everything it produces in 1 year to pay the debt, it will still owe 7 trillion. The combined GDP of the whole of the Latin American countries together is less than 6 trillion. That gives you an idea of the problem. And the United States, because it's been performing economically very poorly, there are many reasons. I don't want to go into too many details there. But because the United States decided to deindustrialize and move its manufacturing sector outside the United States, it got weakened. And then because it financialized the economy by concentrating too much on speculation. The consequence of that was a poor performance, which is in the region in the last 20, 25 years, 1 to 2% per year on average, which is very weak. If you compare that with China, just to put that as a footnote, China was in the crucial period of an average of rate of growth of about 10%, 8%, and now is about 4 or 5%. So China is going to grow in the next 10 years at something like 50%. The United States is going to grow by about 10%. So that gives you an idea of where they are. So the United States, therefore, was importing much more than it was exporting. Sometimes from their own companies outside, but that produced trade deficits which were ginormous. So a poor economic performance on top of a poor exporting performance, plus massive, really, really massive military expenditure, which at the moment is reaching something like 1 trillion per year, which is extremely onerous because the United States doesn't have the capacity to produce that much wealth in order to sustain it. And on top of all of that, 20 years of US wars in the Middle East not only meant that the United States lost them all, although it caused a huge amount of damage and destruction and death and so on in that region. The cost to the, as we say in the UK, to the exchequer, to the treasury, was in the region of $9 trillion. All of these things, have compounded themselves to make the United States to be in extreme crisis. So what the United States is trying to do, rather than accept the rules of the World Trade Organization, which it imposed in the past, is now trying to actually set the terms of the international agenda with the wrong policy, even to strengthen the United States, which is tariffs. That is to say, the United States wants to be in a position that it determines what is the relationship it's going to have with any country. It's going to say, you're going to buy my stuff at the price I want to tell you, and you're going to sell me what I want at the price I'm going to fix. That's basically what Trump is trying to do. And therefore, the application of tariffs, I think, at the moment, is a policy of intimidation of the rest of the world. They started from the most cowardly of them all, which is Europe, which, has been successful so far anyway, as we can see. And then it's trying to implement this with everybody. But to their disappointment, I suppose, they haven't been very successful of intimidating too many. Many countries, in my view, if you look at Canada, Brazil, Mexico, and so on, they're saying, okay, we'll stand up to you. But the worst part of it has been the response of China, which has been extremely robust. And I think they won this first round very massively. And the United States had to capitulate quite humiliatingly. Not that the media are going to tell you this, but that's the case. So now he's going for the BRIC countries. Brazil has been attacked because Brazil belongs to the BRICS. And you can tell the timing of it. The threat of a 50% tariff on everything Brazilian was imposed the day after, Lula ended up the meeting of the summit of the BRICS. So it's clearly going for the BRICS. And the intention of the United States, by intimidating countries into compliance, is twofold. One, to dictate the terms of the trade to their favor. But number two is to force countries to stop trading with China, with the intention of weakening China in order to actually create the conditions for an attack in the future, because they clearly say openly that they are preparing themselves for war with China, which is incredibly ridiculous. However, the United States doesn't have the understanding, certainly Trump doesn't have the understanding how tariffs works. What it means is going to be the United States going to isolate itself economically, and everything the United States is going to import is going to be very expensive for the population of the United States in the context of the bill which they just passed, or a law that just passed, which is a massive assault on the population of the United States. Something like 70 million people in the United States, as a result of that law, which is austerity, are going to lose their medical cover, which is not brilliant in the United States, but to lose it all is gigantic, and so on. So what Trump is doing is accelerating the decline of the United States, even though it's causing a lot of disruption around the world, certainly Latin America, as a target is sort of in a reasonably or relatively weaker position compared to, say, China or other players.
Can you expand a little bit more on Brazil? Because two things kind of coming up to me when you were talking about Trump using these tariffs as a way to try to control BRICS countries, but also I don't understand how it would work as sort of like a disincentive to work with China. Could you clarify what the reasoning is for that? Because we know that with Brazil specifically, he's pledged that 50% tariff, as I think you mentioned before. It's due to come into effect on August 1st. And Trump is using this pretext or justification that it's about former far-right President Bolsonaro's trial. Do you actually find that to be credible in any way, that that is the justification for why he's putting that 50% tariffs? Or do you think it is like mainly about BRICS and China? And like I said, explain that a little bit more. But also, can you expand more on also how Brazil is responding to the tax?
It's a pity that Trump was not sent to school to learn mathematics, because he doesn't understand one bit, one iota of tariffs. He doesn't. Somehow he's been persuaded by some entourage of very incompetent people from the point of view economics, certainly, and I would say politics as well, that this is the right approach for the United States. What the United States is trying to do, or Trump is trying to do, is trying to redress the trade deficit is got with almost everybody else, literally everybody else. He believed that by imposing taxes on whatever you import to the United States, the importer is going to pay. So if China sends stuff, he thinks they're going to pay, but actually he's wrong. The consumer in the United States, the companies in the United States, if you buy steel and you have a tariff of 50% from wherever it comes, the manufacturing in the United States, which is going to use that steel, is going to have to pay that 50%. So it's totally wrong. I think the way it works with Trump following, ever since 2016 US politics, almost daily to understand it. The way it works is like this. When he's in trouble by something he's done, he finds a distraction. But the distraction always fits with what he wants to do anyway. And he presents it in a very outrageous manner. So one good idea, why not, was to say, I want to defend Bolsonaro and I want to apply tariffs to Brazil. So the intention in this particular occasion, apart from the fact that he wants to apply tariffs to Brazil, is that he wants to distract people away from the Epstein files. Now, the problem is this, is totally unjustified. The reason is this. If the United States, Trump, were to be justified by applying tariffs to countries with which it has trade deficits, one could say, well, that's the reason. But in the case of Brazil, Brazil had a trade surplus with the United States only back in 2007. Ever since then, the United States has a trade surplus with Brazil. In other words, Brazil is better off. And the region of the amount of money, the trade surplus, is in the region of 12, 13, 14, 15, 17 billion per year. So it's Brazil which is losing out. And Lula said, I'll reciprocate. Whatever percentage you apply to me, I'm going to apply back. And that's the first reaction that government should have. Not necessarily that that's going to be the final position. And the reason is, whatever you say is going to have an impact on the stock exchange in your country. So therefore, to say immediately this is very important indeed. That's number one. The second thing is that in terms of Bolsonaro, the Brazilians have not given 1 inch In fact, they are intensifying, the investigation and the trial against this crook. He tried to organize a coup d'etat, not 1-3, as far as we know. Then he was part of a conspiracy to actually even assassinate the president, Lula. There is people who have been investigated under detention that declare publicly that actually they had that sort of things in plan. Some of them said, I put in an email sort of as a thought that I wanted to come back to later on. So that's number one. And what the Brazilian government is doing at the time right now is that Mauro Vieira, who is the foreign relations minister, is saying that he wants to start seeking negotiation with the United States, with the US administration, which is the correct thing to do. So the first thing you do is you take a strong position and then you say, let's talk and let's see whether we can come to anything. One thing that Lula made totally clear, which was part of the threat from Trump, was I, Lula, will not allow the United States companies to control our minerals. We will control them, which was clearly part of the deal or part of the threat. Brazil has some rare earths, which are very important, in current technology. So this is not going to happen. And the person in charge of the investigation, who is a judge of the Supreme Court, Alexandre Moraes, he is so determined to ensure that there is justice. And the Supreme Court, that used to be quite right-wing, now is sort of quite interesting. I'm not saying left-wing, but, it's sort of doing justice, which is the right thing to do. Is very determined to ensure that all of these people are tried. And Eduardo Bolsonaro is somebody who may be tried for treason because he's been indicted for negotiating with a foreign power. Guess who that foreign power is? For the foreign power to bring sanctions against his own nation, which in Brazil carries a very heavy penalty. So all of that is going on. And then Foreign Minister of Economics of Brazil, Fernando Haddad, has said that they're preparing the ground to ensure that they protect jobs when and if tariffs hit them. So they're taking all the measures. In other words, they're sending signals to Trump to say, do you want to fight? Okay, we'll have to fight. We don't want to fight, we'll fight. Otherwise, we can negotiate. So in that sense, it's very important. And finally, I think it's quite important to say this. Lula was in trouble because the economy cannot take off because the central bank is fixing the interest rate very high, 10.5%. And the reason is the central bank is autonomous and is run by a Bolsonarista guy. And, the government is desperate to try to sort this one out and it can't. So it's economic sabotage, really. Nevertheless, as a result of Trump's threats, the Bolsonaristas have been weakened because it's against the nation, and Lula's been strengthened. And they just scored a fantastic victory, which I want to finish this item with, which is Brazil, because of the Lula's policies ever since he became president recently, Brazil is not in the hunger map of the Food and Agriculture Organization as it was before. So that's a fantastic one. And they said we're going to deepen this. So I would say this round has been good for Brazil, but there are more rounds to come.
Well, keeping on the subject of Brazil, obviously the question of the unity of progressive forces in Latin America has always been really crucial to the region's struggle for independence, away from the grip of US imperialism. In recent times, relations between two really key countries, Venezuela and Brazil, have been under strain in recent years. And a particularly important recent incident would be Brazil's veto against Venezuela joining BRICS. So in July of this year, it was reported, just in terms of new developments, it was reported that Venezuelan officials are reinstating tariffs ranging from 15 to 77% on Brazilian products. So how should we interpret this development? Are we seeing a further deterioration of relations between the two countries? Can you help us unpack the dynamics that are at play here, please, Francisco?
Sure. I checked this tariff thing. The reason why there is a veto against Venezuela by Brazil, I think, is got very much to do. This is my own interpretation. In terms of, what I know. I think it's being determined by the electoral coalition that Lula presides, which is very broad. I nearly said extremely. It's very broad. is so broad that it includes people who are not very radical. My sense is that the foreign ministry of Brazil, which is called Itamaraty, which is the place where it is, basically it's a neighborhood, they have a huge amount of autonomy historically, not only with Lula, but historically, always have to determine more or less the foreign policy of Brazil, regardless of the government, which in a sense is a source of strength, but at the same time, not necessarily progressive. Nevertheless, it's been good for the country as a whole, overall, historically. And when it came to this issue of Venezuela and the election, the Itamaraty was in touch with the State Department of the United States. And I think that through that mechanism, the pressure for not recognizing the election in Venezuela last year came from. I think Lula, in order to ensure that he maintains his coalition together, because the danger was Bolsonaro, he did this thing. If you don't recognize the government, you cannot recognize them joining the BRICS because the government you don't recognize. So it's a logical conclusion, even though it's no good. Very soon after all of that, I would say a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, the two countries began to talk to each other. I don't know the details. Of course, they're not going to let us know. And Venezuela sent an ambassador, and he was recognized by Brazil right away, which, is a recognition of the government of Venezuela in a way. And then when there was the inauguration of President Maduro on the 10th of January 2025, Brazil sent a special envoy to participate in the inauguration. And I know because I was there in the inauguration myself as one of the international guests, although a very significant one. So things have been mending between the two of them. When you asked the question of these 77%, I was shocked. I said, Jesus Christ, what is going on? And the Maduro government, from what they say publicly, they investigated this and they said it was a technical mistake. And this technical mistake was as a result that the thing is digitalized. So it's a computer system. And they apply 77% to imports from Roraima, which is, next door to Venezuela. It's a border area of Brazil with Venezuela. And they rectified it immediately. This was announced by both governments, by Brazil and Venezuela. That was a mistake, so they went back to where they were. So the problem has been sorted. Thank God.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.